The following program is brought to you by Bruce Telecom and Whiteman TV.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for the kind words about inspiration. Those mean more to me than anything else when I see somebody who can step outside and appreciate the world in which we live on an everyday basis. It's great to be here, and it's almost like Daniel walking into the lion's den. There are so many of you familiar with me and with whom I'm familiar. And it's great to be here and see all of you, from Ball, from the birding community, from Huron Fringe, and just from being friends. Now, as we start out in this program today, just a word of introduction to it. It came about as a request from the Sable group in Kitchener-Waterloo, who come up each year to the Red Bay area, and I have given them talks and done workshops with them for a number of years. And they asked, now, could I come up with something that was natural history, but not local and not provincial, of a national scale, and that would be of interest to a lot of people? Well, there's one thing that I felt really fitted those criteria, and it jumped out as being the National Parks of Canada. In starting my research, I discovered that I had omissions in my understanding, but also a lot of other people don't really recognize what a treasure we have. So this is going to be a journey through the national park system, and we'll talk about these parks as individuals. We'll also talk about some of the challenges that they face, and by the end I hope you'll have a greater appreciation. So as we start out then, we're going to begin with, if I can find it here. Oh, it's in my pocket. I've got so many things. No. I'm wired for sound here with two different mics. Oh, here we are. There we go. So now we're set. So just a couple of things to start off with. And it's a large mandate when you consider the size of our country, from Point Pelee to the northern end of Ellesmere Island, from the eastern tip of Newfoundland to the western tip of Tofino and the Vancouver Island. We are a huge nation. And this is what the Parks Commission is responsible for: protection and preservation of heritage sites for present and future generations. I think yes. But it also means this: to maintain and restore ecological integrity, monitor and ensure the commemorative integrity of historic places, protect cultural and natural resources, and provide appropriate visitor experiences. Now, some of these may appear to be absolutely opposed one to the other. How do you preserve and yet provide access? And that's an ongoing challenge. But this is the beginning then of where we'll be. Educationally, this is a poor illustration because you can't read it. But what I want you to see are the green dots. And those are where we have parks at the moment. And up at the top there are lists. And you notice it's an extensive listing. So that's what you need to know. We have 46 national parks in Canada. We have 5 marine environment or marine protection areas. We have 1 national historic site and 171 historic designations. So it is a wide-ranging section. But for the natural aspect, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on today, how do they go about choosing? How do they go about this whole building of a park system? Well, it's based in this manner. The country is divided up into bioregions, areas that have distinct ecologies associated with them, and then within them we start to try and build a representation. And what you see here is there are a number of those sections across. This shows you how complete the recognition is. The blue areas are areas of marine environment, and the darker the blue, the better the representation of that zone. Likewise, on land, the darker the color, the better the representation, and as we move into the lighter colors, there are fewer representative areas. So the working to complete a park system is based on this type of structure. Interestingly, you notice that the lightest area is southern Ontario and the corridor coming down the St. Lawrence, in which we live and in which the majority of Canada's population lives. So here it is. By 2020, we hope to have 17% of the land base represented and 10% of the marine base represented. Quite a challenge. So let's then move on quickly. We know the target of 17% to that last one. And I'm not going to have you guess, I'm going to give you the answers. And I included the marine reserves when I gave you that, and the National Historic Site, which are the Pingos in the Northwest Territories, to come up with the total of 46 total. And remember, there's the target. So it's quite an extensive reality, and we still have a challenge ahead. Now, this was called driving. This is the one focused on driving. Most of these parks can be driven to, but you will discover that as we leave Toronto and go into the near north, they become a little more difficult. And as we get to the northern end of Ellesmere Island, I'm not sure what type of vehicle. Hyundai and Jeep seem to be competing for the ability, but none of them have advertised the north end of Ellesmere. So we will be hip-hopping and using different transport modes as we go. So just a quick idea. How many would you think here? How many national parks within 4 hours? Yes, just shout out an answer.
Yeah, four.
4, 1? All right, here they are. You know that one. Many of you know this one. Both tiny parks, really. And some of you may be saying, what? Georgian Bay Islands National Park? These are small, both the Thousand Islands and Georgian Bay, because of the dispersed aspect over islands. It's mainly island. There's a very small mainland base in those cases. And in fact, there is one more. The most recent addition to the Ontario Park System. Does anybody know that one just offhand?
Rouge.
Yes, the Rouge Valley, the first urban national natural park. And that was thanks to the cancellation of the Pickering Airport. There was a land base that had been set aside, and that was the building block. So there we are. So here's the location of these various parks. The one we didn't mention within driving distance is Puckasaw on Lake Superior. And we're just going to have a quick look at some of these then as we go. So as we start out, we see the north, and this is one you all know in its varying nature. On the east side, the cliff and the Georgian Bay spectacle. On the west, this completely contrasting landscape because of the Huestor, the fact that we have those shelves of limestone that drift from an elevation in the east to sliding below Lake Huron on the west. And as we see that, the landscape changes. The one is spectacular for its scenery, the other for its importance as a wildlife refuge and a place that's quite different. It is all coming under incredible pressure. And here are a couple of the things that we find. The old age cedars, the oldest forest east of the Rocky Mountains is found along our escarpment. Some of the rare and beautiful. The Bruce is famous for its diversity of orchids, and also some endemic and very rare and susceptible creatures. Now, some of you may say, so what about a Massasauga? But remember, a Massasauga rattlesnake is an integral part of an ecosystem. It shows the health because it is at the tip. And to find its niche, there have to be certain prerequisite conditions for it to live. And that's what parks are about preserving. Not one thing or another, but trying to get this whole complexity integrated. They also have these signs offshore. Point Pelee, going south. A tiny park, in fact, a 15.4 square kilometers. Not the smallest park, but that's not a very large park. And within it is this forest. There is also a wetland. But again, it is an island. If you have traveled down the 401 to Windsor or come from Sarnia and then cut down, you know the vast agricultural complex that surrounds this. And it becomes a desert for many birds. Yet, it is a major stepping stone to where these birds, the blackburnian warbler above and the priula below, it's a major stepping stone for them to reach their nesting sites in the boreal forest. It is also the place where we have natural growing cacti. And remember, the tip of Point Pelee, as we see it there, is further south than the northern tip of California. So that's how far south we are when we stand here. If we go east, it's about Toledo, Spain. So quite different, it's very far south. Yet if we go to the north, we find polar bears and beluga, and we go within a few hundred kilometers of the North Pole. So again, this is the extent of what is represented. It's a huge challenge. Here are some of the spectacular things. The annual migration of monarchs that flips down through. Fox snake and skink are creatures which do not have the ability to fly, but which are captured on this island, and this is one of the concerns. As you get an island, you have a small population of creatures that inhabit it, but maintaining genetic diversity and maintaining those aspects of what they require become very important, because we are now in a time of radical change, both human created, well, mainly human created, but I mean by physical change of the environment, plus climate change. A huge challenge that is coming. Thousand Islands. These beautiful little islands in the St. Lawrence, there are 19 of them, and they do also contain some remarkable things. And here we start going into some of the talks that I'll come back to many times, and that is management. This is a pitch pine, and on the Frontenac axis, that section east of Kingston, when you run into the limestone again and you run across before you reach the St. Lawrence and the confluence with the Ottawa, you have this patch where these trees can pop in along this axis. And pitch pine then is one that is dependent on fire, and so what you see here is smoke behind that, not mist. That's not just a nice morning shot, but it is this. Fire being used, and fire we now know is one of the most basic land management strategies that nature has created over time to ensure diversity, to ensure an ongoing change. And so this is being done selectively to create the conditions where this one tree can come into being. But along with it, there are the associated other aspects of an environment that change. The ground cover changes. Different mammals will feed on it, on the berries, etc., that result. Jumping then quickly to the Georgian Bay Islands, these are off Parry Sound. Glorious and mainly known for their spectacular and beautiful iconic images. This is what many people think is northern Canada. It's really southern Canada, but it is great. And if it is that, what has created that within us? It's almost a culture, isn't it? And this has helped greatly in developing that. It is the land in which the Group of Seven found a lot of their early inspiration. And this is Franklin Carmichael. Was that the section he painted at the top? You've seen several presentations recently where they've located each of these paintings. I'm not sure that this is one and the same. It could be any of 1,000 islands, but you see the inspiration. And what does that mean for Canada? So there is a cultural aspect to natural places as well. It is also the site of a defined dark sky reserve. So this is going beyond what we might consider the role of the national parks. But they recognize that dark skies are important for human reality and spirit, but they are also important for ecology. Dark skies are what many animals use, birds especially, to migrate, other animals to hunt and to move through their territory. And so it is important that these become reservoirs where we can see these ourselves, but also understand that the lifestyle or the blood of a natural ecosystem is continuing in these places. The Rouge, this is what it takes as you come along 401 going through Toronto. You get to the east side and suddenly the highway makes quite a dramatic bend towards Whitby and Pickering, out through Pickering, Whitby, and you cross this tiny little parcel, but you do see it's natural, but then it extends north and you see the different colours again. Not a great map educationally, except to say that it is a work in process. So these are areas that have been preserved, other areas that are being looked at in different ways for preservation. Not something that we might jump over and say, oh wow, isn't this great? But remember, the population of the Greater Toronto area at the moment is now in excess of 5.5 million people. Many of those, the city is their understanding. It is their environment, it is their ecosystem. So to come and see something like this, especially newcomers, this is something that is really important. It is also one of incredible canoe country. If any of you have canoed that shoreline, you've gone around Pacassaw, and very, very demanding because the open waters of Lake Superior wash across it. So we've talked a little bit about parks and size, so we can just do a little bit of this. The first park, what was the first park in terms of your understanding? What was the first park in Canada? Banff, I hear, right, absolutely. And when was it established? A very early park, and actually before the park system. We'll talk about how that happened. What is Canada's largest park? Now you may say this is guessing, and it is. Do you know this one? It's been in the press a fair deal recently because now, and we'll talk about it at the end, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the impact of the tar sands and the development of those resources means that it is now under threat. And UNESCO has said something has to be done to mitigate these threats, otherwise it will have lost its integrity and it will be delisted. What a black eye to have our largest national park as one that would be delisted as a UNESCO site. Again, challenges. How do we balance things? And if we don't need to go to national parks, just look at pipelines. The smallest park, there it is. So it's really tiny. Now we're going to go west, and we're going to come across the country quickly and end up going north and through the Arctic before we get to the end of this. So it's a rush. It's going to be done in just about the hour. Maybe, yes, within the hour. Okay, You notice here that we have 3 offshore reserves and parks that take in a lot of the Pacific coast. And then we have this group of what are called 7 parks. I don't show them all there, but Jasper, Banff, Revelstoke, Kootenay. We also think of Yoho, Glacier National Park, Waterton Lakes. Those are the others in that grouping, and they're known as the Mountain 7. And it's just of interest, I'm just going to change my glasses here for a second and give you the exact use. Last year was a high period of use, but it was incredible. As we look at the number of parks, 46 remember, the total use last year was 24.74 million people visited our national parks. 24.75 million people visited. Now those are entries, it may be repeat, but that was the use. Of that, the mountain parks are responsible for 9 million. Everybody likes the spectacle of Jasper, the Columbia ice fields, Banff, and so on. Banff itself took half of that 8 million at 4.3. Now compare that with our little Bruce Peninsula National Park, which is 154 square kilometres and the largest contiguous area of natural preservation in southern Ontario below Algonquin Park. Now think where the population is, think of Bruce Peninsula, think of the images that are constantly put out in tourist brochures of that shoreline, and now we know why last year close to 5.3 thousand, I got the wrong one, Bruce Peninsula, close to 400,000 people visited that tiny area at the north. And they didn't spread over the whole park. Most of it was to 2 sites, the Grotto on the east, the Singing Sands on the west. So huge pressure, and that's another one. Point Pelee, in a contrast and comparison, it's 15 square kilometres, and it had 333,000. So pressures of population are really important, and they're having impact. So it's one of those concerns. So with this, let's go quickly west. And we think of these magnificent parks, the forests, the spruce, the mountains behind. And it all started as this hotel was built. Notice how quickly it was done. Already the railway, Sir Johnny Macdonald had pushed that track across the nation to unite it and to make sure the United States didn't move north. And here we saw the immediate response to something. And this was why. It was the Banff hot springs that drew an interest. It was a time of spas in Europe when people went to these, and to have a spa that you could have in Western Canada in this spectacle of mountains and snow was incredible. Discovered totally by olfactory disgust. These 3 prospectors were walking along and they got this sulfide gas coming up and thought, ugh. And they went to find what it was and discovered this, and then they recognized what they had. And immediately it came. How many have had the pleasure of being in Banff Springs, hot springs? Yes, look at this. We've got maybe what? Close to half of you. So that shows the attraction in a group like this. About half of you have been there. How many, when you were at Banff, took time to look at this? How many? Hands up. I see 3 people, 4 people. Aha! And here we have a tiny snail, and the only place it is found in the world is in this hot spring. So the challenge now is, how do we preserve it? And it has been preserved. There's a section of the hot springs that has been set apart. But again, look at the contrast in what has to happen. Now, the Banff Springs are not part of the national park, actually. They're slightly apart, but this is the scenery that we think of. Here are the animals that people hope to see. The top right, not so likely, but it is there. And it's important that you know it's there, because again, if mountain lions are finding a home, you know the system is healthy. They need the vastness, they need the number of prey to feed upon. And it speaks to that. Here's the opposite, of course. Mount Edith Cavell at the back and Banff Springs itself, and the constant push for development of this. This is where everybody who goes west ends up at some point in the trip. It is an incredible pressure. And at the moment, that's one of the big discussions. Do we expand this? Do we not? And with cut funding over the years, national parks have been really squeezed for finances. So here's another pressure that comes into management of this national treasure. What does getting there involve? It means roads, it means railways, it means lots of traffic, and it means death to bears, both on the tracks and on the roads. It means death to goats and elk. And now we have these overpasses that you can see. And these are very effective, as it turns out. But look how many of them there are. So animals that are using this have to find this to make their crossings. So it does change the behavior of animals and how they go. The other aspect is to make tunnels below. And I want you just to notice this fellow. Look how nice and svelte he is. You'll see a grizzly bear later on. He looks more like my hair on a windy day, and you'll see why. Again, the spectacle. How many have been up this little road? Onto the ice fields in the... Yes, several of you here, a good number of you onto the Columbia ice fields. But before you get there, you remember from the main highway what you've passed. Symbols that said 1952, 1960, what are all of those about? It's the recession of the glaciers. These are changing, and these are changes beyond our control, except for climate change. And we're not dealing with that yet. So beyond our control, it's exponential in its growth, it's exponential in its impact. So where does the water come for these rivers? Glaciers. What happens once the glaciers go? These go. And when these go, what happens to little guys like this, who nest on them? And remember, there's another demand on these. Kayakers, whitewater rafting. That is a demand. So how do we reach the balance? It's not just something one should travel into and say, wow, isn't this lovely? But you should think about how fragile many of these things that we hold as being forever indeed are. And without our concern, without our voice going to governments to say, look, these are important, and put preservation as a major aspect of it over economic development. Yoho, again, one of these 7 mountain parks, and Lake Anderson. And what I want you to look at here, talk about glaciers. The Cirque Glacier here is quite nice, caught in the cirque here where snow builds up, and this valley which is built up again, a small cirque that has broken through. But it was painted by J.H. MacDonald. Look at the ice. Oh, sorry. Change in a very short time, but change which is quite profound. But again, the cultural aspect, the beauty that has been seen and captured and portrayed. This is what people go to see. This section, famous for the Burgess Shales, which are, as you can see, forms of shale laid down in ancient seas, but of a particularly fine material found in only about 3 other places of the world, where when an invertebrate little animal going around in prehistory landed, and it maybe had feathers on its feet or little extensions that looked like feathery feet, or lungs that were gills, those could be imprinted into this and preserved. And so creatures like this have become important. And this is also another UNESCO site, because there's one of these that gives a view into the very early development of life on Earth, which was much before any of the larger order animals and so on. Beautifully done and preserved. You can visit it, but only with the accompaniment of park staff. One of my favourite parks, Revelstoke, and one of the reasons is it's a great spot for the little owl, little elf owl up at the top, and down to the right, the blue grouse, blue grouse. And I should say that when my wife and I were there at one point, we were looking for blue grouse, and it was interesting because we could hear one booming. They have this deep, deep woo, 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 that they go, and you can see how they blow up and display. And it's totally ventriloquial, and we tried to get a bearing on it, and finally we looked up and the bird was right above us. But quite interesting. But beautiful birds, again, ecology of an entirely different type. And here we see key aspects of it. And again, it may not be, you think, oh, here they are. But when we see the amount of backcountry skiing, offset course skiing, the use of snowmobiles now, which are riding to the tops and down of various mountains, the impact on wintering habitat is the big concern for many creatures like this. They have it to themselves in the summer, but it's pretty tough sometimes in winter. It's also a matter where this summer we heard of this. Yoho was one of the 7 parks that burned this summer. The other was Waterton Lakes, where they were just able to save the old and iconic hotel, but lost a couple of the park's buildings. So these massive fires, and again, what this is doing to habitat, increasingly large, increasingly fierce, and increasingly damaging, but because of previous management, in a certain degree, which suppressed fire, and over the years then built up a tinder that once a fire like this took hold, it was off, and took on these gigantic proportions. The same in Fort McMurray a year ago, and going back. Nahanni, one of the great ones, was Virginia Falls. Also Travertine Terraces. It's known for its kayaking and its canoeing and its rafting, but these are areas that are much more remote and very attractive, like Yellowstone. This is our Yellowstone. Again, hot springs and these beautiful spots and bubbling ponds. It is also the first park that has taken in a huge tract of indigenous defined lands that were important to the unity of the whole. And that is now an increasing part of all parks planning, is indigenous input. And the Nachiho at the bottom on the right is the section that was added. And quite a remarkable section, not as splendid as this, but important, and we now realize important also as grizzly territory. It is extensive in that respect. Now out to the west. How many have been here? This is one of quite a well-known spot. Okay, we've got a couple, Willie and Audrey, out to the west, and spectacular scenery, but also a cultural site as we go to the Queen Charlotte's. This was the home of the western coastal tribes, the Nootka and the others, Haida, but again based on rich resources. This is Pacific Rim, and this is the great Pacific Beach close to Tofino. But as you look into the ponds, you see the richness that is there and that sustained these highly complex and sophisticated societies on that west coast. It's also the site where you get these magnificent temperate rainforests, and these are the old forests with which our little scrubby cedars compete. But every bit as remarkable. And salmonberry, all sorts of good things here, but also the sections of trees, this one doesn't show it, but the trees that stood and that were used for the building of the longhouses of the West. They didn't fell trees, they took planks off them. And when you walk through these virgin forests, you see trees that have one side completely flat. Because again, they didn't have the materials to fell effectively and take sections off these huge trees. So what they did was they wedged them and then used the slope of the hill, walking up, to pull the plank off. And then you could cut it and take it out. So a rather interesting relationship there. This is as you see, National Park Reserve on the southwestern tip of Vancouver Island, and one of the spots where you can sit and actually watch these magnificent animals passing you. So we have the killer whale coming past. This is the Salish group, and now the most highly endangered of the West groups, with 72 animals presently in the group. But again, traveling the huge shipping lanes that connect Vancouver and that West Coast hub to the Pacific and East Asia. And again, this is part of the concern with more tankers moving through these areas. So the orcas face a huge amount of change with that, but also with the changing water temperatures and the declining salmon upon which they require for sustenance as the rivers heat and as salmon stocks decline. Arbutus, one of the most remarkable trees in Canada. Elk Island, we're just going to take a quick look at these, but it was initially developed to reintroduce elk into the southern parkland area of the boreal forest. They had been extirpated, and now the herd is doing particularly well. It is also a site, again, for dark skies and wonderful place to go if you want to see northern lights, one of the most reliable and easily accessed. Grassland, a national park in two sections, and it looks pretty well wasteland, doesn't it? But this is short grass prairie. And this was maintained and kept by these animals, the plains bison, and they were the element that maintained these and kept the whole ecosystem in place. And it is a rich one when we start to look at it, because when you get that short grass prairie, now you get prairie dogs. And when you get prairie dogs, you get places for burrowing owls to nest, you get places for Canada's one of the two rarest, both of them here on the short grass prairie, but the black-footed ferret. It was down at one point to 12 animals, completely extirpated from Canada, but now back in our prairies, and along with its little friend, the smallest fox we have, the swift fox, which is struggling to find its foothold again, but it's here. And up at the top, right, our fastest mammal, and likely the second fastest land mammal on the planet, and no predator from which it needs to run. So why has this occurred? This is one of the interesting enigma of these places. There's an ancient history that precedes what we see today. And this one goes back to the time when we had saber-toothed tiger and we had cheetah in North America. And these two, the pronghorn antelope and the North American cheetah, co-developed. They came together. And sadly, the cheetah has gone, but this animal, with its pacing to outdo the cheetah if possible, still exists and still runs. Remarkable animal. So just a little story that goes behind. What we see is not always just what hits the retina. It's an understanding of what goes behind it. And these short grass prairies bloom. Wood buffalo, our largest park, and much of it looking like this. Huge areas of muskeg with islands of small spruce poking up through. It's at the confluence of the Athabasca and the Peace River, coming in from the mountains to the west, the Athabasca from the south, and one of the richest wetlands we have in North America. And the site where, back in the late 50s, they discovered the dwindling nesting grounds of the whooping crane. And it was from here that the current whooping crane recovery was started. This is our largest crane. Again, at one time down to very few birds. When I was a boy, it was down to 18. Now it's up in the mid-hundreds. When I say that, 150 to 160 birds, depending upon the year. It's also the site where we find bison, but these are different. Plains bison are quite interesting animals. They stand about this height on the cows, and the bulls are about this size. These fellows, wood bison, start with the cows about this size and bulls looking more like a Holstein bull. These are much larger animals, and they live in the forest. It's interesting, some of our greatest bovines, the largest bovine, it comes from India, that's the gaur, and again it's a forest living animal. It's sort of counterintuitive, but these have been there. The only herd of Canadian bison that were never put into captivity or brought into a human bondage, they are now regularly brought in for anthrax control, an introduced disease that came with contact. But they're doing very well. But the other thing about wood buffalo is it's huge. It has these wetlands, remarkable places. It also has that scope for a complete ecosystem. And what completes an ecosystem if not bison? It's the predator that takes them. So timber wolf is an important part. And it's often faulted for a whole lot of stuff, totally misplaced. This is the keystone animal. And when it's there, again, you know you've got a healthy system. Take it out and things begin to change. And Yellowstone was one of the greatest proving grounds of that when they took wolves back, and it has changed the complete ecology of Yellowstone back to what it was described when first discovered by people moving west. It had changed and has now returned. So it's quite interesting the impact a predator can have, like fire. At the peak, there's a control. This is what's competing with now. So this is just outside Fort McMurray, but notice here the sheen on the river. And we know of ducks getting onto those tailing ponds. We've had some horrific pictures of ducks flying into these tailing ponds, which are supposed to curtail any noxious materials. But look at the impact on the landscape. Look at the pollution, not known before. This infrastructure, all of this, and again the pollution of water. And the amount of water that is taken to keep this system going, and whose effluent comes back out and on down. This is what is changing the nature of wood buffalo. If we look at it, there's wood buffalo. Northwest Territories up here. This is Saskatchewan. Here we have a Manitoba coming over. But as we notice right here, and here's the Athabasca coming up. Here's the Peace River coming in, and then on down and on down into the Mackenzie. So critical areas and critical wetlands, but a remarkable impact. There's how close it is, and the projection is that it will reach the boundary, because that's okay. We have a boundary. That's where the park begins. So we can go there to develop without any concern, because that has been drawn. But that's not how natural systems operate. They go beyond the straight line. You just need to walk into any woodland and try and locate a straight line that nature has put in place. It doesn't exist. And this is the problem. The aspect of outside influence is having an impact. And by the way, you notice that these are the dams that we're now getting into problems with out west. Do we build them or do we not? And of course, what does that do to water? It impounds it, it holds it, it heats it, and releases it in different surges. There's no longer a natural flow. There's no longer a spring freshet that comes down to renew nutrients and so on. These become reservoirs for sediments. This is changing the quality of what we send into a national park. And again, economy versus environment. It's an age-old one, but a very, very tough one. Many of you know this one, the beaches of the Prince Edward National Park. Historic site there, many of you know as well. And of Green Gables, right. And of course, this wonderful little bird, which we have at Sauble. This is piping plover, but this is the Atlantic population. You tend to get these different populations which survive in completely different conditions. Ocean conditions for a beach, ocean conditions for feeding, completely different to what we have on the Great Lakes. How many have been to this site? Yes. And thanks to you, you took me to it. I had never been there before. And you're going to show up here in a second. Stuart and I went down to a piping plover workshop in the early years of that project. And we went out and explored some of the surrounding areas of the Bay of Fundy. It was in Moncton. And we ended up on beaches like this. And there's Stuart looking for piping plover and looking for shorebirds. Spectacular area, but one which is again of worldwide importance. It's an important birding area because a vast percentage of the world population of this little guy, semi-palmated sandpiper, use this beach for 2 to 3 weeks each fall as part of their migration from the Arctic to the south. And this is where they fuel up. This is the petrocan, the Esso station, whatever you want to call it. And what is the food? Lugworms and many other little invertebrates that they pick up, scud, etc. And they will, in many cases, double the weight. They come in on empty, they fill up, and then they're ready for a flight that will take them several thousand of kilometers south, non-stop. And this weighs about the weight of a toonie. So there are miracles that pass us. And I know bird watchers are famous for ticking. Oh, seen it. To me, if we don't think beyond that tick, we lose the connection with a world where that animal and ourselves have reached this point through exactly the same history on this planet. We've traveled the same path of evolution that has brought us to 2 separate areas, but that has passed through the same process over the same time. And to me, that is an overwhelming reason to preserve these creatures. Who are we to say that that's lesser and that that beach should not be there for them for 3 weeks in a year? Challenges that go forward, and they're more than economic, they're more than physical. They become part of our cultural and our philosophic concerns and talk. There they go. 2 weeks and they're gone. The flashing wings. And these great birds, whose wingspan is like mine, sorry, I don't fly, but it's the same. Gannets, wonderful feeders and spectacular when they do feed. Plummet feeders that come down, and notice how they go to arrows. They come in, turn, and then suddenly do this, and just as they hit the water, look at them. They're like a torpedo that can go down and catch the fish that are below. And normally those fish or I shouldn't say normally, but often they're pushed to the surface by whales, which are feeding in the same area. The largest whales in the world, the blues and the fins, are regular feeders along the Forillon coast. And other fish feeders as well. So, we're coming close to the end. Well, maybe I should say, where would these be? Are they down in Essex County? No, not likely. The opposite extreme, right, far north. How many of these know these two? How many of you know these two? Toktu Nogait? No. Aulavik? Interesting terms. We'll see where they are shortly. The hardest to reach. Okay, here they are. This one is in, as you can see up here, in the very northwestern portion. Here, Ukasiksalik, that wasn't in that other list, but here's Auyuitak, Aulavik, Kitnirpak. This is a wolf trap built by Thule, so we're going back not beyond the Inuit, or the Eskimo as we called them. We're going back to the preceding cultural group, the Thule, who were stone masons in grand scale. And this is an inverted pyramid, the inside of which is hollow. So you put the bait inside, the wolf would come up, drop down in, and then you would spear it with harpoons through the openings in the rock. And there you had your nice cuff for your anorak. Kitnirpak, right to the north end now of Ellesmere Island and Hazen Lake, and it has 2 of the 7 remaining ice caps in Canada. Nothing to compare with Antarctica or Greenland, but we have them. Spectacular areas, and ones where we see glaciers still coming down. Believe it or not, this far, we're now within 200 kilometers of the North Pole when we reach this point, and it's an Arctic oasis. Yes, with big bunnies. Now, we talk about Easter bunnies. These are good ones. They're about that size. They're big animals, but also filled with floral extravagance. 2 different saxifrage, pearlwort, the Arctic poppy, Arctic cotton. Spectacular lands. Auyuitak. Again, one of the spots I had the privilege of guiding over a number of years. Spectacular. Now, since this photograph was taken, that glacier has disappeared. That's the Niflheim, and it had a split glacier that was quite dramatic. This is Mount Thor, incredible. From there to there is approximately a kilometer in vertical drop, and it's where the longest free rappel in the world was established a number of years ago. And they ran into an interesting problem, that when you jump off the top of a cliff like that and rappel down a rope, the rope tends to stretch. So the first person down had a rather calamitous end to their trip down. Not deadly, but nearly so. So they had to change behavior, but they had quite an interesting climb to get up to do that. And again, that has now been prohibited. That type of a record setting is now outside parks allowance. You will not get permits to do this type of activity into them. In fact, overflighting is now severely restricted here. This is starting from the actual village of Pangnatung, and this is the valley going up. And you notice these lovely stranded clouds. They're a feature of this area. As the day warms, they move up. As the day cools, they move down. Well, who was there a few years ago other than A.Y. Jackson? And there it is, the same spot. He noticed those clouds too. There they are. So A.Y. Jackson gives us a painting of that area, and they got everywhere, the group of 7. It was really quite remarkable. Now we're coming to the end, and Toktu Nogait, the place where you hear caribou, and it's famous for its white water and these deep canyons where some of the greatest raptor populations, especially this little fellow, the gerfalcon, are to be found. It preserves that, but it also preserves the tundra above, which extends beyond these chasms. And it is there that we find, again, more barren ground caribou, and we find the Franklin's ground squirrel and hairy grizzlies. When you live in the Arctic, you need a fur coat. So notice the different evolutionary behavior here in the behavior, both summer coats. But these grizzlies largely feed on this little fellow by digging him out. Aulavik on the western island, very sere, very open, expansive land through which one waterway travels, but home to two of the most enigmatic of our creatures, the musk oxen to the top, and down below, Peary caribou. And notice they still have quite big antlers, but the little guys here, Peary caribou from the stage, only stand about this height. They're tiny caribou, but now one that is severely endangered. It used to number in the tens of thousands on these Arctic islands. Now it is down somewhere between 2,000 and 1,500 animals across the Arctic. And why? Again, changing climate. We now got ice storms that coat this in winter, and these animals can no longer access food. Also, many of the migratory patterns took them from island to island. And as the Arctic Ocean warms, those passages are not freezing in. So the animals are now being caught and denied access to winter areas. It's a great concern, and it's one that you don't hear a lot about. It's even hard to find numbers, but a lot of work is being done on these spectacular little animals. And this is how you find them. Always in 2s and 3s, never more. A little patch out in the middle of, you'll be flying over hundreds of square kilometers of tundra, and then suddenly you find 2. And go another 100 kilometers and you find another 2. Very widely spread. Anyway, with that, here's the good news. Lancaster Sound. Shell Oil gave up all of its proprietary permits for exploration and exploitation coming off into Lancaster Sound, and this was good news because then it allowed us to put aside this designation of a marine conservation area. And this really is the Serengeti of the north. And this is an amazing aspect. People say, well, there are lots of bears. But what has happened is that as the ice cap collapses, there is an opportunity for a short time for one animal, ringed seal, to make use of that. It comes up and pops. Polar bears, that population, the seal population expands. In response, the predator expands. So you get the seal population going up. Now the polar bear population comes up. Now we've had a collapse of the sea ice. And I mean a collapse, complete almost. And when that happens, the seals have no longer anywhere to pup. They are on the sea ice all the time. That has happened. And now we're seeing this impact on polar bears and a move ashore. Seeing polar bears on shore is not good news. They should be out hunting on the ice. And now we're seeing them in. So things are happening. And I hope that this isn't entirely negative. What I'm trying to say is, look at what we have. What does it mean that a country such as Canada has these and discusses what to do about them? And look at the pressures that are there, not to say anything of our burgeoning population worldwide as well as in Canada. So with that, I would like to say thank you. It's been a good trip, and I hope you've enjoyed it and have something to think about when you leave.
The preceding program was brought to you by Bruce Telecom and Whiteman TV,